And get started. Good morning, everyone. If you don't know, my name is Kristen. I'm a wellness coordinator for Healthy UNCG, which is UNCG's Employee Wellness Initiative. So welcome to the third series of our fall virtual wellness series, Mobility Snacks and Hacks. Today is about how short movement sessions throughout the day can improve strength, flexibility, and overall movement patterns with Dr. Ann Brady. I'll let her introduce herself in a second, but we just want to remind you guys to continue to use the chat, be interactive if you're comfortable with that. Dr. Brady is going to be doing a very interactive presentation, so hopefully we'll see a couple of you guys up and moving. Just a reminder that might help if you pin Dr. Brady's screen so you can continue to see her along with her slides. And feel free to drop any questions or any comments in the chat. Feel free to ask us anything, and if we we will be sure to relay those questions to Dr. Brady after the presentation. So Dr. Brady is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology. She teaches a variety of kinesiology courses, and she's the director of HOPE, which is a community-based exercise program for older adults that provides practical experience for kinesiology majors. And I'll let Dr. Brady kind of tell you a little bit about herself, and we will kick it off. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. So I guess you guys want me to wait and share my screen in a second? Doesn't really matter, I guess. Okay, well, anyways, thanks for y'all joining today. I was excited to be a part of this wellness series. I think Kristen gave a good enough introduction, so I won't spend too much time. I'll mention HOPE a little bit if y'all have questions about that. But yeah, I teach a lot of classes. I'm in the kinesiology department. I primarily teach undergraduate courses. I direct an exercise program, and I supervise our interns. So stay pretty busy, but excited to be with you guys this morning. So let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay.
You're all good. Perfect.
Thanks. And I have multiple screens. So if I'm looking down, I'm looking at you guys. And if I'm looking up, I'm looking at my slides. So I'm also going to, I know you guys are going to help me, Stephanie and Kristen, but I'll pull the chat up too so I can see it. We've all been on Zoom enough. We know how to do these things. So I'm going to get started and briefly talk about why I chose this topic, talk about some terms. I think it's going to be important that we all know what I'm discussing, why we should engage in mobility training, and then how we can actually do that. As I said, I want this to be interactive. So I want you guys to get up and moving. I always overplan. So if we don't have time, I'll kind of skip through some stuff so we do get to get up and move a little bit today. I was also telling Stephanie and Kristen that I teach enough classes on Zoom where there's not a ton of interaction. So I'd much rather this be a discussion. If you'll have questions, I'm happy for you to interrupt, put it in the chat. I know Kristen's going to help with that also. So happy to answer any questions as they come up. So why this topic of mobility? I think you all probably know Stephanie. And so when Stephanie and I get together and we decide we need to have a meeting, we always walk and talk. And so that's just a good way for us to get some exercise in and also get some work topics covered. So we walked and talked a couple of weeks ago after she asked me to give a presentation. I said, tell me a little bit more about the audience and who would be listening to this, and then what would be of interest. What have y'all done with these kind of talks before? And one of the things I think that came up was doing short bouts of exercise throughout the day, and then also doing some flexibility work. And so in teaching my undergraduate class, I think one thing I've kind of found is that there's a bit of misinformation and there's new things coming out about flexibility. And so I thought that would be of interest. And then in addition, as I mentioned, I direct an exercise program. And some of the things I've seen kind of change over the years since I've been here, and some of the new things that I'm implementing in our exercise program, I thought would be of interest. And then personally, I've been doing a lot more strength training and really working on movement patterns and getting into deeper movement patterns. And really this all ties to mobility. So that's why I chose this. Again, I thought would be interesting. So let's start with what does this mean? When I say mobility, so mobility can be defined as the quality or state of being mobile or movable. And just to clarify, we can think of mobility like ambulation, but I don't particularly mean ambulation when I say mobility. What I'm thinking of for this kind of talk is that mobility is at this intersection of flexibility and strength. Okay, so if we look at flexibility, that's just basically the range of motion at a joint. So I think that's kind of what we're all familiar with. And then if we look at mobility from this author's definition, he likes to call it the usable range of motion at a joint, which I think is helpful to picture. And it has the degree of control and strength in specific positions and movement patterns. Okay, so I would also add in that when we think about mobility, it requires a certain level of stability and coordination. This paragraph also, I think, is a really nice distinction between what's different between flexibility and mobility. So you can picture a person with great mobility is able to perform functional movement patterns with no restriction in their range of motion of movements, whereas a flexible person may or may not have the core strength, balance, or coordination to do the same functional movements as a person with great mobility. So I give this example in my undergrad class, and I don't think they have heard of this, but when I think of flexibility, y'all know Gumby, right? So you can think of like Gumby, like being very flexible, but being flexible doesn't mean that you're necessarily have great mobility. So this was a great video from the Institute of Clinical Excellence, and they were demonstrating the need to do exercise in a very meaningful way. And so this was a video, and they were making like comparisons between what you do in your everyday life and how that compares to what you're doing in the gym, and how we can target exercise to help you in your everyday life. And so a lot of these really focused on mobility. So if you look at this lady picking up heavy bags, and you can look at her hip angle, she has to be able to squat down, have good strength, good coordination, good core ability to do this task. Same thing with this, a very functional task of carrying heavy objects and climbing up stairs. And then this one is one of my favorites because I'm always in my exercise program getting people to get down on the floor. Even though they say they don't like to do it, it's really important to skill to be able to maintain as we get older. And so again, if you look at this hip angle, she's got to have a lot of flexibility there to get down. But again, looking at her shoulder, she's got to have stability through the shoulder. She's got to have core strength. And this again is kind of how I think we can operationalize this term of mobility. And then I threw in snacks and hacks because I wanted to kind of explain this a little bit. Halloween is coming up. Hopefully I'm not going to eat my kids' candy. I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and they're excited about trick-or-treating. But what I mean with that are short bouts of exercise or movement throughout your day. If we look at why people say they don't exercise or they don't do certain things, it's that we feel like we don't have time. And so the question is, well, how short can these bouts be? Recent research shows that less than 10 minutes can still be effective. This is more with aerobic exercise, but I'd say the same is probably true for these mobility things. And at the end, I'm going to give you guys a challenge. So we'll follow up on that maybe later. And then when I say hacks, I don't necessarily mean this is a shortcut, but I do mean that these things we're going to do today and the things I'm going to demonstrate can be very time efficient, and they can be effective, I should say, if they're done consistently. So leading to the next part as far as misinformation, and again, I think a bit of a distinction between flexibility and mobility. And I want to just clarify, when we think of flexibility, we then automatically think about stretching, okay, and how important stretching is. But stretching is a real umbrella term. And then within stretching, we've got lots of different types of stretching. So we have static, ballistic, dynamic, PNF. I don't intend to go into any of these in great detail. But again, if y'all have questions, but most of the time, people are engaging in static stretching. So you reach down, you touch your toes, or you try to touch your toes, and you hold that static position, okay? So I want you guys to engage either the chat, or those of y'all that have your camera on, you can raise your hand. I'm I'm going to give you a little quiz here. So there's 3 questions, and I want you to tell me if you think they're true or false. So the first is that stretching improves flexibility and range of motion. So raise your hands if you think that is true. Okay, anybody raise your hand if you think it's false? Or you can put it in the chat. So far, everybody says true. 100%. Okay, so yeah, we know that even acutely, if you reach down and try to touch your toes and held for 30 seconds, and then you rested 10 seconds and you did it again, you'd probably reach farther the second time. So acutely, we can have improvements in range of motion and flexibility. In the long term, we know that you can also improve your range of motion and flexibility with stretching. So what about stretching improves performance? And I'm talking more of like a sport. So if you stretch, I should say before, if you stretch before you compete in something, like before a sport, does that improve performance? So what about if you think this is true? Okay, most people, yes. Anybody say false? Nobody wants to go against the grain here? Okay, I'm going to say false. Good, Kristen. And also kind of like a we don't really know. Okay, so this comes down to certain sports that require speed or explosiveness. If you do a lot of stretching before that, it's going to impact your stretch reflex. So not to get into too many details, but it actually is going to decrease your ability to generate speed or power. Okay, so if you're thinking long jumping or sprinting, doing certain types of stretching is going to negatively impact your performance. Okay. In other sports, we're not really sure. Okay, so what about the last one? Stretching prevents injuries. What about true? Okay. Anybody want to disagree? Any false out there? Okay, this is another one. Stephanie says now everybody's scared to answer. You could always just be like my students and just not answer. But this one, again, there's data to say that sometimes and sometimes not. What really helps prevent injuries is warming up. It is not necessarily the stretching itself. It is increasing the temperature of your muscles and your body. It is increasing blood flow, but it's not necessarily the stretching itself. So when they've done studies that said, you know, if people go walk or do something else, do they have, you know, greater injuries than those who stretched? And really, it doesn't seem to be the stretching itself that improves or that decreases risk for injuries. Okay. So thinking about kind of some of these things I just mentioned, should we still be stretching? Okay, is stretching itself that important? Well, yes, it's still important. Okay, so if we look at major health components, and these are kind of different health areas that we should focus on, that's your aerobic fitness or your cardiorespiratory fitness, muscular strength and endurance, body composition, and flexibility. However, an article came out last year, and I have my undergrads read this, and we do a little discussion and a debate. And this came out in 2020 by Jim Nuzzo, and he has the title of it. It's an opinion piece, but he has, I think, close to 200 references. The case for retiring flexibility as a major component of physical fitness. Okay, and just to pull out a few things from the paper so you can kind of get a glimpse for what he's meaning. He's talking about static flexibility. Okay, so he's not saying we shouldn't do dynamic flexibility, but he's talking static flexibility because that's what most people do. And then the test that's often done is a sit and reach test. So again, those of y'all I can see, how many of y'all have done a sit and reach test? I think like everybody, when you were in school, depending on your age, you did a sit and reach test, which I'll mention is probably not the best assessment for flexibility. Another thing that the author mentions is that his point is that stretching should be de-emphasized as a standard component for most populations. Not that we should never stretch, and not that it's not important for certain populations, but again, for most people, we should have a little bit less focus on stretching. And then the other point is that functionally relevant levels of flexibility, so the flexibility that we need, can be maintained or restored with other exercise modalities that give you a more robust health and performance benefit. Okay, so essentially what this is saying is that if you engage in resistance training through a full range of motion, you get a lot more benefit than if you just did static stretching. Okay, and I'll acknowledge this. This is to say this is kind of my perspective, and I'm trained exercise physiologist, so I'm not saying that that stretching is not important for things like mental health, or that there's not other benefits, particularly for populations that may have joint issues. But as far as what is the best bang for your buck to improve your health or your performance, or some of these physiologic factors, doing some other types of training would be more important than doing stretching. So with that in mind, every 3 years, ACSM, which is a big kind of governing body for exercise science, they put out new guidelines. And so these are the guidelines for exercise testing and prescription. They came out this year. And so interestingly, I wanted to point out a couple of changes that, unless you study this stuff, they're kind of minute, you may not really notice. But this is, again, kind of one of their points about flexibility. Again, they define it, ability to move a joint through its complete pain-free range of motion. But if you read some of this, they talk about maintaining flexibility of all joints facilitates movement, may prevent injury. However, it's impossible to state with confidence that pre-activity stretching unequivocally reduces injuries. I mean, to me, it sounds like they're a bit unsure, right? So the literature regarding everybody should do stretching to prevent injuries, we're really getting away from that literature. They also mentioned the previous guidelines, again, used to use sit and reach to look at low back and hamstring flexibility. However, hamstring flexibility is really, in most cases, unrelated to low back pain and is a questionable measure of hamstring flexibility, the sit and reach is. Okay, so even the tools that we're using to look at flexibility are a little less relevant. And then finally, they mentioned for an optimal exercise prescription, we should address, again, all these components of health, your aerobic capacity, your muscular fitness, mobility, flexibility, and body comp. But what's interesting to me is that this is the first time they mention this word mobility. So again, in the literature, and I've been reading these guidelines since I was an undergrad, we never talked about mobility. We only talked about stretching and talked about flexibility. I'm laughing at Kristen's comments. She was good at it. I was really bad at the sit and reach. I felt really good about myself because I could do pull-ups, which most of the girls couldn't do, but I could never pass the physical fitness test because I couldn't do the sit and reach. So knowing all this, and again, knowing that we're kind of moving away from flexibility, and I've kind of talked about what mobility is mobility important? Okay, you can probably guess my slant on this, but mobility is important to the extent at which it impacts the other things we want to do in life. And for some people, that may be your sport or whatever you kind of think of as your performance, maybe your exercise. For some people, that's activities of daily living, so just the things you do in your normal life. And for some people, that's your leisure pursuits. So maybe going hiking, again, that takes a certain amount of flexibility and strength. So if we think about, okay, yes, it's important. What types of things do we do that actually require mobility? Well, one thing is squatting. Okay, so if you look at this fit looking young man, his ankle, his knee, his hip flexibility, he appears to be holding a heavy barbell. Okay, now I know that probably doesn't relate to a lot of us. I'm not going in the gym doing heavy back squats. Okay, but maybe this relates to things that you do. Okay, that it's not me, but that probably could be a picture of me and one of my boys out gardening in our yard. Okay, but the movement pattern's the same. I mean, you can see the similarities between what he's doing and what she's doing. Another example would be something like a stair climber. So we know people that go to the Kaplan Center or go somewhere else, go to a gym and love doing the stair climber. again, it can be a great exercise, but even tasks like this, when we think about hiking, require a fair amount of mobility. Okay, so again, you can see, not so much in this, but underneath, you can see her hip angle. Again, she's having to use core strength. She's being flexible. She's using strength to do this activity of hiking. So hopefully I've convinced you that mobility is important. But again, it's also this intersection of strength. Okay, so if we think about how strength changes as we age, and this is where I really start to nerd out, because this is the stuff I'm really interested in, is kind of looking at things across our lifespan, particularly between middle age and older adults. And we have age here on the x-axis and muscle strength on the y. Generally, our muscle strength peaks around early life to early adulthood. Okay, and after that, we see a decline. Now, that decline can be pretty rapid. This would be somebody who does not engage in any strength training, or it can be not nearly as rapid. And again, this would be somebody who stays active, they're physically active, they're exercising, they're engaging in resistance training. And really, a lot of these changes are less a result of aging and more a result of change in behavioral activities. So if we see older adults who remain really active, they can have just as much strength and mobility as younger individuals. I also see this, so I mentioned the HOPE program that I direct, and oftentimes in a lot of programs with middle age and older adults, we do things like chair stands, and I do this too. So for some people, this is an exercise that is very good. They maybe can't get into a deeper range of motion, so we're having them sit in a chair, stand back up. And what we're trying to do is preserve this strength. So this is a great activity. What I'm doing a lot now with some of my folks in my program is I'm seeing if they're having difficulty with the squat movement pattern, is it that they don't have the flexibility? Okay, and interestingly, most of them, when I have them hold on to a TRX, can get into a very deep. So it indicates to me that there's not necessarily a lack of flexibility, but there is a lack of either strength or coordination or stability. Okay, so this is a good way, and we'll do this at the end, to kind of look and say, okay, is this a flexibility issue or is it a strength issue that is inhibiting mobility? So most things that you do in life, again, whether it's your sport or your exercise or what you do in your free time, requires some combination of this strength that we're trying to preserve across a lifetime and being coordinated, having flexibility, having balance. And again, that's what I would kind of define mobility as. It's, again, this intersection of flexibility and strength, but also requires coordination and balance. So now we know it's important. We know what it is. How do we actually do this?
Hey, Anne, I think we had a good question
Sure.
right at that slide. And the question is it possible to pretty much keep mobility from middle age to old age if you really try?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say yes. Again, but it does require that you do things that involve both strength and flexibility. I don't think, I have to look at this. I'm interested in the research side. I'm also interested in the practical side, but I don't think there's been a lot of studies to look at maintaining mobility, again, as I'm defining it, across a lifespan, because we really just haven't focused on it. We focused on strength and we've measured people's static flexibility, but we've not really looked at how well do these people actually move, because it's difficult to objectively measure like we like to do in research. But I think, yes, if we keep up with the strength and the flexibility, and again, I'll show some things at the end, then I think, yeah, we could definitely maintain that. So getting kind of to that next point is, how do we train mobility? If we do want to preserve that, like this question is, if we want to preserve it from, middle adulthood to older adulthood, then how do we do that? I would also throw in a point too, kind of related to that, is you can improve mobility. So you actually, even at any age, may not be that mobile. Again, I've talked about with my strength training, I've been doing a lot more mobility, and I've gotten much more, again, I'm not sure I want to say flexible, but I can get into these different positions and movement patterns that I couldn't have done when I was 20, just because I didn't train that way. So this is a quote from a Canadian strength and conditioning coach named Charles Poliquin, and he says, strength is gained in the range it is trained. So the idea is that if you are doing exercises and only moving in a small range of motion, you only develop strength in that small range of motion. So if you were to need strength in a deeper squat, you wouldn't have it if you don't train in that range of motion. Okay, so oftentimes when I've worked with folks and they'll say, oh, you know, my doctor said because of my knee pain, I shouldn't be doing squats. I'll never be able to do squats again. And this is kind of a joke, but we always ask them, well, do you use the bathroom? Because every time you get off the toilet, you're squatting. Okay, every time you get out of a chair, you're squatting. And even these days, we have these, I don't know, I think they're called comfort height, but they even make toilets higher. So our range of motion doesn't have to be as deep. We don't have to squat as deep. Okay. So we have to think about mobility training in the sense of let's do some strength training, but in a great range of motion. So these are just tips that I would suggest when we think about this, is moving through a maximal, and I want to emphasize pain-free range of motion, using muscle strength, coordination, and stability. Thinking about these movement patterns or exercises, we should pick things that are simple. So things that are really low complexity and they're easy to remember, because if they're not, then we're not going to do them. We also want to pick things that are sustainable so we can scale them. So again, I'm going to show some examples and hopefully y'all will join in. And even if you've never done this stuff, we can figure out a way where it would be appropriate for you or for somebody who's been, you know, doing some of these exercises for years. And again, the big point with really anything with exercise, but particularly mobility training, is that we have to do these things consistently if we want to see improvements. Okay, so it's not like we do it for a week or we do it for, you know, a month. We need to do these things all the time in our daily life. So these are the ones I'm going to go over. All of these happen to be lower body. They're a little bit easier to demonstrate, but again, a lot of times when we think about mobility issues, we think about our hips, our knees, and our ankles. So that's why I'm going to focus on these. So if you have a desk or something sturdy, a chair not on wheels, then try some of these with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move my camera. So you're probably going to be looking at like my knees if you're watching me, but I also want you to still be able to see the screen. So I'll move that in just a second. So the first one is called a knee over toe split squat. And the first thing I'll address is that people say, well, my doctor told me or someone told me my knees should never go over my toes. When I squat, I should never do that. Okay. And that, again, I would say is kind of misinformation. If you do not have strong quads, quadricep muscles, strong knees and ligaments, then yes, I would not load somebody up with a heavy back squat and have their knees go over their toes. But in everyday life, and again, this would be unloaded, so we're just moving our body weight, safe if you don't have knee problems. Okay, and even if you do, there's some room to improve here. So this is what this exercise will look like. This is a guy named Ben Patrick, and he's become pretty well known in kind of the fitness world right now. And he's just kind of jokingly named himself knees over toes guy, and that's really taken off. But he's had numerous knee surgeries and kind of created his own training plan. And so he's really well known for doing this knee over toe split squat. Now, why should we do these? Again, I think this is a movement pattern that we say, well, we shouldn't be doing this, but every time you go down the steps, you can see here, his knee is over his toe. Okay, so this is something we do all the time. We just don't train it. Also, if you're standing up from a chair and your feet are not too far out from front of you, every time you stand up, your knee is over your toe. So these are things that we do naturally. So it would make sense to train it just to, again, improve this movement pattern. So this particular movement is important because it strengthens your tibialis anterior. So that's the muscle on the front of your shin. It's It's important for knee health. It helps us with ankle dorsiflexion, which is important for squatting. So you can see this is dorsiflexion, his ankle here. And it involves pretty much all the joints of the lower body. So instead of doing one stretch, in this movement, you're stretching your hips, your knees, and your ankles. There's lots of variations. So you can elevate your front foot. So if he put his front foot on a step or a book, that makes this easier. You can do hand supported. When I say tempo, you can move into this movement and then hold it. You can, do it quickly or slower. So you can add different pauses, which is going to make it more challenging. And then once you feel really comfortable with the range of motion, you can add weight. Okay. So I'm going to move my camera. Hopefully I don't make you guys too dizzy. Okay, I think y'all can see enough. I'm not wearing shoes today. So we're going to begin in a split stance. So that means we have our feet far apart. It's kind of like we're doing a lunge. Okay, so we're going to be in a split stance. We want weight on both of our feet. And I don't know if y'all can see my hands really, but I'm holding on. I'm in between a bed and a small table. I'm going to hold on here. And what we want to do is slowly descend down and forward. So when we do a lunge, we're just going up and down. And this one, we want to go forward. So we want to drive our front knee over our toe. Okay. So I'm going to just kind of move into that pattern right now, as far as you can go, and then you can press back up. Okay. So a couple other things to be mindful of is that front heel can lift up a little bit. What we're really trying to do is sort of close this gap between our hamstring and our calf. So if that front heel comes up a little bit, that's okay. We also want to try to keep this back leg as straight as we can and our torso upright. So as you move into this, you should feel a very deep stretch here in your hip flexor, but we're also working on your ankle, your knee, and your hip. So this would be something you could stand up from your desk and do a couple reps, and then you can switch. Somebody said it's not the descending, it's the ascending. But that's, again, where we're getting some strengthening with our range of motion. So yes, when you're coming back up out of this motion, you're driving through this front foot and pushing back. So we're strengthening our knee and our quad in this exercise. Okay, so I don't see any particular questions. So that's a knee over toe split squat. So again, I think you can see if you're going through that, how you can feel that in your joints, but also with strength training. I know you're looking at my knees. I'm going to go to the next slide here. So Kristen says, is your back knee hitting the floor like a lunge? It should not, unless you're really flexible like this guy. So we want to keep that back leg mostly straight. So if it comes down, we want to try to then press through that back leg. And some people may not be quite as flexible here in their hip. Okay, so that's, again, it's going to stretch in that area. Yeah, so the modifications would be to elevate that front foot, which makes it not as hard, and to hold on to something. So that would make that a little bit easier for this knee over toe. And a lot of these modifications you'll see are similar across the exercises. The next one is called the Cossack Squat. And this is kind of what it looks like. This would be an assisted Cossack Squat. And this one is really important because if you think about the exercises you may do, we pretty much move in the same plane of motion. So squatting and lunging and bicep curls, we're all moving kind of front and back. Whereas this movement, we're moving side to side. And we do move side to side in real life, but we don't often do that in our exercise. So this, again, involves ankle dorsiflexion. It involves all the joints in the lower body. So it is really similar to that first one, except we're moving side to side. Okay, so you'll see the variations are the same. To modify this, he could put this foot that he's leaning on, he could elevate that foot, would make it easier. She's doing a hand supported. So you see that makes it a lot easier. So let's try this. Again, if you're somewhere where you can try it, I'll kind of turn this way so you can see me better maybe. Again, I'm holding on here. So my feet are really wide. My toes are pointed forward and holding on. I'm going to come down as far as I can. Again, we're really trying to close this gap between that hamstring and your calf. And then I'm coming back up. So you may just be here initially, and that's okay. So as you get more comfortable, you can increase that range of motion. So you're coming down, and as you're coming back to center, you're pressing through that foot to come up back to center. So the goal with this one, again, similar to that last one, is that your torso stays relatively upright and your other leg stays straight. So one difference that you may feel as you're doing this one is that you'll feel that more in your inner thigh. So the next one is a deep squat. And again, sometimes just that term can be intimidating to people. So that's what a deep squat would look like. Again, I would suggest if you go to Kaplan, or if you're on campus or you have anything like this in your house, you can use a TRX to assist. So this is important because it's going to develop strength, again, through that maximal range of motion. We're trying to not just do a half squat. We're trying to go as deep as we can. And this is unloaded. So it's not like we're holding heavy weights right now. We're really practicing getting through a great range of motion. But as some of y'all commented, you can really feel how difficult it is to get out of that movement or out of that deep squat. Okay. So again, this would be an assisted if you're holding on to an object. The other thing I'll mention that you can see in this picture is a heel lift. So although this uses hips, knees, and ankles, he's got kind of a wedge here. When he puts that under his heels, he doesn't have to flex his ankles as much. So it can use his hips and knees more without having to be as flexible in your ankles. So I often do this in our HOPE program. People will stand on weight plates or even dumbbells if they're stable and can get into a deeper squat. Okay, so for this one, again, your knees and toes can be out slightly, but you are just descending as far as you can. And if I weren't holding on, I probably couldn't get this deep. But again, because you're assisted, you can hold on here, and then we're standing back up. Again, if you're comfortable, you can come down and you can hang out here for a couple seconds, and then press back up to standing. I'm going to skip this one only because I know I'm running out of time. Right, Kristen? Am I supposed to be done at 11:45?
Oh, no. I'd say like 11:50, give time for questions and everything. You're still doing well. You're fine.
Okay. Well, we'll still skip this one. We'll come back because I want to show one more. So this is an elevated pigeon. You may have heard of a pigeon stretch. A lot of people have a difficult time getting into this one. So this is something people do in yoga. But this is what it looks like. And this is something, again, you can easily use a chair. So if you're in your office, you can turn around and use your chair for this. But what's different about this one is it works hip external rotation. So think about if you had something on the bottom of your shoe and you were trying to look at it, that's kind of what this movement pattern is. It's an external rotation of the hip. Okay. And a lot of times when we are doing things that are single leg and we're moving this foot, so one example is kind of getting into a car. You can imagine sitting down and you kind of have to turn your leg. That's an example of when we would use this. So one of the questions is, does having it elevated have it different than doing it on the floor? Not particularly. It's just one way to modify it. So it makes it a bit easier if you have a little bit less range of motion, so you can elevate it. But it's particularly going to work the same movement pattern, the same muscle groups. Okay. So different than the previous ones, this one's also going to hit your piriformis, which is a muscle in your glute. And then it's also going to work your psoas muscle, which is in your hip. Okay. So what we would do with this one, you're going to put your hands down on an object. How well y'all can see that. You might see my cat up here on the bed, sorry. And you're going to externally rotate your hip. Okay. From here, you're going to get this back leg mostly straight. And you really want to square your hips so that you're facing forward. Even in this position, I can feel this in the glute of my leg that's elevated. From here, you can hold, or you can kind of come down on your forearms and press back up. So the more you come down to your forearms, you're going to feel that deeper into your glute. Okay. We also want to keep this back leg as straight as we can. So if that starts to bend, we're going to straighten that leg because that's going to help stretch out our hip flexor over here. I'm going to move you guys back up. So hopefully that gave you an idea of, again, it may just be kind of what you think of as stretching, but a little bit more dynamic in nature and different than typical static stretching. So again, I think I'm going to send these slides out, right, Stephanie? So you guys will have these to look back at. Here are some practical tips, because I think a lot of times people give information and it's like, well, that sounds good, but how am I actually going to do it? So I can try to attach some videos. I don't have any, but I can find some of those easily. But I would suggest by doing some of these stretches once to twice a day. So it doesn't take a long time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And you could do each exercise for 1 minute. Again, you're not looking at a huge time commitment. Again, you're going to move through what is a comfortable range of motion for you. So there's lots of ways to make these easier or harder. Again, one of the main things is just holding on to something for stability. You're not looking to all of a sudden be able to do a deep squat while you're holding dumbbells. You're just looking to kind of train your body to be able to go into greater ranges of motion so that you can do the things you want to do that require both flexibility and strength. Think about your movement patterns more than you think about muscles. Again, sometimes, I'm coming from an exercise physiology standpoint, but sometimes we think, well, what exercise can we do for a particular muscle? But rather think about what do you do and how do you move? And that will help these exercises be more functional and more time efficient. Okay, so when I say time efficient, I mean, you can do multiple muscles and joints at the same time with one mobility exercise. Okay, so here's an example. You could sit at your desk and you could extend one leg and you could reach out and try to touch that toe. And that is going to stretch your low back and it's going to stretch your hamstring. But it doesn't require any stability. It doesn't require any coordination. And she's really hitting just those two spots. This is the one I skipped over, but this is called a pike squat. So it's the deep squat pattern that we practiced. And then you're holding on to an object, you're raising your hips and getting into what's kind of called a pike position. So in this, he's still stretching his hamstrings and his low back, but now he's also incorporated his shoulders. He's incorporated his ankles, his knees, his hips, some needed strength and some coordination that you wouldn't get if you were just doing some static stretching. Again, and once you have done this a number of times and you get more familiar with it, you can add a lot of variation. So you can use less assistance, maybe use more body weight. You can add some tempos. So again, maybe you move slowly into that position. Maybe you hold it for a few seconds into this deep squat or into that pigeon stretch. And then again, when you feel more comfortable and your movement pattern is really large and you have a great range of motion, you can add weights. So in summary, things that are important for your everyday life and your own pursuits, again, no matter what that is, it's probably going to be some combination of muscular strength, some flexibility, and some coordination and stability. Okay, and so if we group all those together, what I'm really kind of summarizing is that mobility is important, okay, because it incorporates all these things, and pretty much every task or every exercise or every pursuit, I could probably pick out and say, okay, well, this part of that activity requires a certain amount of strength, and this part requires balance. And so if we look at this again in combination, mobility is going to be really important for many of these tasks. Gosh, mobility programs. Probably one I would recommend is what somebody asked in the chat box. Are there any mobility programs I'd recommend? I probably, if it's knee or hip or ankle, would recommend that knees over toes, Ben Patrick. So he's got one called Zeros, and it's no equipment. It's easy to implement in addition to if you're already exercising. So again, it's not something that's going to take, hours. But I could send some links. I could look into that and give y'all some more information. So mobility training, again, it may be more beneficial than static stretching to improve. And again, I'm highlighting this idea of usable flexibility. Being able to get into these really, contorted positions doesn't, yes, it may mean you have good flexibility, but it doesn't always translate into anything meaningful. Okay, it doesn't help us in our everyday pursuits, whereas being able to use flexibility and strength in combination can be really helpful. And last, that mobility training can be done anywhere, and it doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of equipment. So again, these tend to be barriers to exercise for a lot of people. But again, the things that we just didn't take any equipment besides something to hold on to. So you don't have to have a TRX or have any special equipment. They can be easily implemented at your desk or before you start exercising, or even before you go to bed, anytime when you want to do it. So here I'll leave you with a challenge, is to choose some of those things that we went through and try them once to twice a day, 3 times a week for 2 weeks. Okay, so if you're saying, well, how long is that going to take me? Maybe 10 minutes a day. Okay, so 5 minutes a session, if you only do 2 or 3 of those. And then I want you to think, after 2 weeks, how do you feel? Okay, so do you feel any better? Do your joints and your muscles feel any better? I want you to see if you think your range of motion has improved, because it will, again, if you're doing this consistently. And do you find that it translates? So can you do other things easier by implementing some mobility work? Okay, so again, I guess from an anecdotal standpoint, I don't do a lot of stretching. I warm up before my exercise and I'll do some cool down, but doing exercises where I'm incorporating either my body weight or some external weight and getting into different ranges of motion, I have noticed a tremendous difference just with my overall fitness, and little things like picking up my 3-year-old from the ground. Like, I could do that easily before, but when you're squatting and picking up 30 pounds, it's just not much of a challenge anymore, I think, because I've incorporated some of this mobility work. Stephanie's going to poll y'all in 2 weeks and get some feedback. I like it. So that's all I have. Again, I know you guys are going to help me, Stephanie and Kristen, if there's things that you guys, questions that came up, but I'll also look for some mobility programs that I'd recommend.
And there's a quick question. Did you just see that? Perfect.
Yeah, about the Cossack Squat.
Yes.
That's a great question. So really, there's different ways of doing it. Let me go up to that slide. I think if somebody's trying to do a Cossack Squat really strict and say, well, this is how it's done, this foot should actually be pointed down. This one should be down, but that requires you to be very, very strong in your hamstrings. Okay, so when you allow your toe to rotate up, or excuse me, in your adductors, so that's here in your inner thigh. Okay, when you allow your toe to rotate up, it switches some of that stretch from just your adductors and your inner thigh to also let your hamstrings help. So this is actually probably a modification. Ideally, you'd want your toe flat, but again, as you're moving into these movement patterns, I just see what feels comfortable. And again, try to increase your range of motion every time you do it. So Stephanie asked the HOPE program. So yeah, if y'all are not familiar with HOPE, it stands for Helping Others Participate in Exercise. So we exercise on UNCG's campus every Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 6 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. So we are an early morning program. And it is myself, I'm the director, and then I have a graduate student. And then it's also a way for our undergraduate kinesiology majors to help. And so they get hands-on practical experience. It's an elective for them. And depending on the number of students we have available, they will do personal training. And so you can sign up to work with a student for the entire semester. This semester, what we're doing is they sign up for sessions. And so you would have one-on-one sessions. We lead group exercise every session. And it's really holistic in the sense that we focus on resistance training. We do aerobic exercise. So we lead an aerobic class on Wednesdays, and then Friday is balance and agility. And yes, it is open to the community. So it's on campus, but it's not exclusive to UNCG employees. When I first took over the program, I had found out that the name actually used to be Helping Older People Exercise, but it had since been changed to Helping Others Participate in Exercise. And we used to really cater towards 50 and up, but now our youngest person is 40 and our oldest is 85. So we've got a huge age range. We have a huge range in abilities. But again, it's nice because you get to use Kaplan and you get some supervision and you get some expertise instead of just going into a gym and trying to exercise on your own. But yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about that. Again, I'll have my email if you have any questions, and you could come in and visit if you want to see if it'd be a good fit.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. Oh, we had another question. Does yoga help with mobility?
That's a good question. I would say yes. I mean, because again, in yoga, you're moving into these greater ranges of motion. I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in yoga by any stretch of the imagination. And so I know there's different types of yoga, but again, I think one that is going to use body weight and involve a lot more strength and moving into different positions. But yes, I would think again that you're going to have a lot of benefits that are going to carry over from doing yoga to increase in mobility.
Great. And if no one else has any questions, I'll just remind everyone that we will send this recording out, as well as any resources that Anne sends us. We'll send that out as well. But thank you all for being here. We have another wellness series program next Thursday, and also Dr. Brady will be in a part of our Women's and Aging panel in November. All of that can be found on our website, Healthy UNCG. And thank you so much for being here. Again, feel free to email us with any questions, comments, and we will, yes, lunch will be provided if you register by November 5th, I believe, for the Women's Health and Aging panel. Check all of that out on our website. It'll be a great time. And thank you so much for being here, for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Ann Brady for being a part of our wellness series, and we hope everyone has a great day.